I really think that we've just been able to encapsulate the amount of difference in not only in my voice but in the kind of person I've become over these past 2.5 years.
Picture a 17-year-old boy standing under studio lights, sweating through his shirt, barely able to meet the eyes of four strangers who are about to judge him in front of millions of people. He has spent most of his life being mocked for the way he looks. He has spent almost none of it being told he's good at anything. And in the next 90 seconds, his entire future is going to change, not because a panel of celebrities decided to be kind to him, but because he opened his mouth and a sound came out that nobody in that room was prepared for. That's where the Jonathan Antoine story really begins. But it is not, by a long way, where it ends. This is the story of a shy kid who became an overnight sensation, lost the biggest prize of his life to a dog, built and lost a musical partnership, fought a private war with depression, and, years later, finally got an answer to a question he'd been asking about himself since childhood. It's a story with more layers than the headlines ever gave it credit for. So let's get into what actually happened to Jonathan Antoine. In the spring of 2012, a classical crossover duo calling themselves Jonathan and Charlotte walked onto the Britain's Got Talent stage. Jonathan Antoine was 17. His singing partner, Charlotte Jaconelli, was 16. Neither of them looked like typical reality television contestants, and that was sort of the point. They weren't dancers, they weren't comedians. They were two teenagers who loved opera and musical theater, trying to convince a skeptical panel that classical singing still had a place on a Saturday night talent show. It didn't start well. Cowell, never one to hide his first impression, made a dismissive remark about the pairing before they'd even sung a note, essentially bracing the audience for another disappointing act. The other judges didn't look much more convinced. Jonathan, by his own later admission, was the quieter of the two on stage, letting Charlotte do most of the talking while he stood there looking uncomfortable. Anyone watching at home could have been forgiven for assuming this was going to be a short, awkward audition. Then they sang the prayer, and the room changed. Jonathan's tenor voice, full, resonant, shockingly mature for someone his age, filled the auditorium in a way that caught everyone off guard, judges included. By the time the performance ended, Cowell had gone from open skepticism to comparing Jonathan's voice to Luciano Pavarotti, one of the most celebrated tenors of the 20th century. It was the kind of reversal that talent shows are built around, the moment where the panel is proven completely wrong, on camera, in real time. The clip spread fast. Within days, the audition had racked up millions of views online, and Jonathan Antoine, a teenager who had never performed for an audience of that scale, was suddenly being talked about across the world. It's worth pausing on how strange that must have felt. One week, he was a schoolboy in Essex. The next, strangers on other continents were watching him sing and calling him a prodigy. There was an uncomfortable subplot to the audition, too. Partway through the judging process, Cowell floated the idea that Jonathan might be better off ditching Charlotte and pursuing a solo career, a suggestion made on national television about a partnership that hadn't even made it past its first audition. It's a sort of comment that, in hindsight, looks less like an insult and more like a preview of where the story was eventually headed. But at 17, hearing a judge suggest you should abandon your best friend and singing partner in front of an audience of millions is not exactly a vote of confidence in the team you built. The duo advanced through the competition, delivering a well-received performance of Caruso at the semi-final stage before returning for the final, with a reprise of the prayer. Both performances earned standing ovations, and by the time the series reached its finale, Jonathan and Charlotte were widely regarded as one of the strongest acts of the season. Everything pointed toward a win. It didn't happen. The 2012 series of Britain's Got Talent was won by Ashley Butler and her dancing dog, Pudsey, an act built entirely around choreographed tricks rather than vocal talent. Jonathan and Charlotte finished second. For a duo that had been tipped as favorites for weeks, it was a genuinely deflating result. Jonathan has since described the disappointment candidly, admitting that losing stung in the moment, even if he later came to see it with more perspective. It's a strange thing to process, pouring everything into a performance, being told by industry legends that you're extraordinary, and still watching the trophy go to a different kind of act altogether. Here's the part of the story that a lot of people don't fully appreciate. Coming second on Britain's Got Talent turned out to be one of the best things that ever happened to Jonathan Antoine's career. Almost immediately after the final aired, Simon Cowell's label, Psycho, moved to sign the duo to a record deal reported to be worth around £1 million, a figure that made headlines almost as big as the audition itself had. Losing the competition hadn't cost them the opportunity. If anything, it barely slowed things down. Their debut album, Together, arrived in the autumn of 2012, built around the same kind of classical crossover repertoire that had made their audition so memorable. It performed well commercially, cracking the upper reaches of the UK album charts and selling hundreds of thousands of copies. Critics picked up on Jonathan's voice specifically, describing it in terms usually reserved for far more experienced singers, rich, warm, and unusually mature for a performer barely out of his teens. Television crews followed the pair around. Documentary cameras captured their rehearsals and tours through Europe, and for a while it really did look like a modern fairy tale. Two teenagers who'd been overlooked, thrust into international stardom almost overnight. But fairy tales rarely account for what happens once two people who are still figuring out who they are get pulled in different creative directions. Their second album, Perhaps Love, released about a year later, hinted at where things were heading. It leaned further into contemporary covers and, notably, included solo tracks recorded separately by each singer, a small but telling detail for anyone paying attention. Charlotte was drawn increasingly toward musical theater. Jonathan wanted to go deeper into classical opera. Neither ambition was wrong, but they were no longer pointing in the same direction. And two teenagers navigating global fame rarely have the luxury of slowly working out those differences in private. By early 2014, the partnership was over. Jonathan and Charlotte announced they were going their separate ways, both having been offered individual record deals with Sony Classical. The public statement they released tried to frame the split gently, emphasizing gratitude for what they'd built together rather than dwelling on the reasons behind the breakup. Predictably, the press coverage wasn't quite as generous, with some outlets suggesting a more dramatic falling out than either party ever confirmed. Years later, speaking with more distance from a moment, Jonathan gave a more grounded explanation for why the duo ended when it did. He's talked about how Charlotte had helped build his confidence to the point where performing on Britain's Got Talent was even possible in the first place, and that the two of them had created something genuinely meaningful together. But he's also been honest that neither of them was really built to be part of an ensemble long-term. They were both, at their core, solo performers who'd found each other at exactly the right moment, made the most of it, and then reached the natural point where a classical crossover duo simply couldn't stretch any further, without becoming something else entirely. Once he had the confidence and self-understanding to make that leap on his own, he took it. In an odd way, it validated the very suggestion Simon Cowell had made back at the audition, that Jonathan might ultimately be a solo artist. It just took 2 years, 2 albums, and a very public breakup to get there. What followed the split was less amicable than fans might have hoped. Jonathan has admitted in interviews that he and Charlotte drifted apart almost completely once their professional partnership ended, chalking it up to the demands of the industry rather than any lasting personal rift. Charlotte, for her part, had said around the time of the split that ending the musical act didn't have to mean the end of their friendship. But in practice, the two largely lost touch. It's a common story in the entertainment world. People who share an intense, high-pressure experience together, only to find that once the shared project ends, so does most of the contact. Naturally, given how close the two appeared on stage, speculation about a romantic relationship followed them for years. Both have consistently said there was never anything romantic between them. Charlotte has described Jonathan more like a brother than anything else. But that hasn't stopped fans from continuing to wonder, even now, whether there was more to the story than either of them let on. To really understand why the Britain's Got Talent moment hit as hard as it did, it helps to go back further. To Jonathan Antoine was before any of this happened. He was born in January 1995 in Essex, England, to a police inspector father and a mother who ran the household. From a young age, by several accounts, as early as 4 years old, he was targeted by bullies. It wasn't the ordinary teasing most kids experience. It was sustained, and it focused on his weight and his appearance in ways that clearly left lasting marks. Like a lot of kids in that situation, he found refuge in the two things that made him feel safe: food and increasingly music. The turning point came when he was around 11 years old and enrolled at West Hatch High School in Chigwell. There, teachers including Jenny Ewington and Jeanette Brown noticed something in him that his classmates and bullies had missed entirely: a genuinely exceptional singing voice. Ewington in particular worked with him to build his confidence through performance, pushing him into concert singing as a way of pulling him out of his shell. It worked. Students who'd previously known him mainly as a target started referring to him, instead, as the boy with the incredible voice. By his mid-teens, Jonathan's talent had become impossible to ignore. He auditioned for several of London's major music conservatories and was accepted into more than one, eventually choosing to study through the Royal Academy of Music. He picked up awards on the local festival circuit, performed at prestigious venues, including the Royal Festival Hall, and had already built a reputation as a serious young classical talent, all before Britain's Got Talent ever entered the picture. In other words, the audition that discovered him wasn't really a discovery at all. It was a spotlight finally landing on years of quiet, hard-won progress that had started as a coping mechanism for a lonely, bullied child. After the split with Charlotte, the obvious question was whether Jonathan could actually sustain a solo career, or whether the duo's success had depended more on the pairing than on either individual performer. His debut solo album, Tenore, released in October 2014, answered that question fairly emphatically. It reached #1 on the UK's classical album chart, making him one of the youngest tenors ever to top that particular chart, and it crossed over into the mainstream pop charts as well. Reviewers responded warmly, describing his first solo effort as the arrival of a genuine new voice on the classical scene. That same year brought one of the more surreal moments of his career, an invitation from Placido Domingo, one of the most famous operatic tenors alive, to perform as his guest at a major music festival. For a young singer only a couple of years removed from being an unknown teenager, sharing a stage with one of his idols was about as strong an endorsement as the classical world could offer. He also toured the United States that year, including appearances tied to Muhammad Ali's celebrity fight night events across several states, steadily building an audience beyond the UK. His second solo album, Believe, followed in 2016, blending classical arias with more contemporary material, including a rendition of Leonard Cohen's Hallelujah. Jonathan has said the album was partly inspired by a relationship he was in at the time with a Canadian woman named Michelle Doucette, whom he'd met online and described as a major source of personal inspiration during that period. By 2020, he released Going the Distance, a concept album recorded with the Royal Philharmonic Orchestra and filmed in Toronto, which became his first television special in the United States. That project included his first recorded performance of Nessun Dorma, widely regarded as one of the most technically demanding pieces in the tenor repertoire, a clear signal of how far his voice and confidence had developed since his teenage BGT audition. By any reasonable measure, Jonathan had proven the point Simon Cowell made all those years earlier. He didn't need a duo partner to succeed. He'd built a genuine solo career, on his own terms, largely centered on the classical repertoire he'd always loved most. Success, though, doesn't erase what came before it, and Jonathan has never pretended otherwise. In multiple interviews over the years, he's spoken openly about struggling with depression, tracing much of it back to the years of childhood bullying that shaped how he saw himself. Around the time of his Britain's Got Talent breakthrough, that struggle became serious enough that he had to withdraw from a scheduled performance at the Royal Albert Hall, a stark reminder that even at the height of his early success, his mental health was often barely holding together behind the scenes. He's also spoken about a difficult relationship he was in during his late teens, describing a partner who struggled with serious mental health issues of her own, including self-harm that she made no effort to hide from him. For someone already carrying his own depression, being close to that kind of pain took a real toll, and he's described the relationship as leaving lasting emotional scars even after it ended. Through all of it, Jonathan has credited his family, his father John, his mother Tracy, and his sister, as his main support system, showing up consistently through the ups and downs of his career in a way his former singing partner, once his closest professional ally, no longer did. Rather than keeping his struggles entirely private, he became increasingly open about mental health publicly, joining awareness campaigns, and even co-authoring a children's book focused on anti-bullying themes, using his platform to speak directly to kids going through something similar to what he went through. His relationship with his weight ran along a similar arc. Having used food as a source of comfort throughout a difficult childhood, Jonathan carried that weight into adulthood. Around 2018 and 2019, managing an underlying thyroid condition alongside a renewed personal commitment to his health, he began a serious effort to change his lifestyle, one that would eventually produce one of the more dramatic physical transformations of his public life. In 2022, not long after turning 27, Jonathan received an autism diagnosis. He didn't make it public immediately. It wasn't until a couple of years later, around Autism Awareness Day, that he shared the news with his followers on social media, describing the experience of reassessing an entire life already lived as something both unsettling and clarifying. He's spoken about how the diagnosis helped explain patterns that had shaped his whole life, the intensity of his focus on music, the difficulty he sometimes had navigating social situations, and a persistent sense of being slightly out of step with everyone around him, even at the height of his fame. He's since said the diagnosis gave him language for things he'd always felt but never quite understood, framing his past not through excuses but through explanations, a distinction he's returned to more than once when discussing how it changed his relationship with his own history. Rather than keeping the diagnosis private, he's chosen to speak about it publicly, in part because he's seen how much it resonates with fans who reach out to say the same realization helped them understand a partner, a child, or themselves. It's a theme that runs through a lot of his more recent interviews, using his own late-in-life clarity to help other people get there faster than he did. He's continued to manage ongoing depression alongside the autism diagnosis, describing himself as still medicated and clear-eyed about the fact that mental health struggles don't simply disappear once you understand where they come from. They're something you learn to live alongside, rather than something you defeat once and for all. Between 2020 and 2024, Jonathan's physical appearance changed dramatically enough that longtime fans sometimes struggled to recognize him in newer photos. Reports of his total weight loss vary depending on the source, with some estimates putting the figure at well over 70 pounds and others suggesting it may have reached beyond 100. Whatever the exact number, the shift was significant, and Jonathan has attributed it to sustained, unglamorous lifestyle changes rather than any dramatic shortcut, consistent daily walking, careful management of his thyroid condition, and a fundamentally different relationship with food than the one that had defined much of his childhood and young adulthood. He's talked about the discipline of walking roughly 10,000 steps every day, treating it almost as a non-negotiable ritual, and has framed the whole transformation less as a response to public scrutiny and more as something he did for his own health and sense of control over his life. It's the same discipline, in a way, that shaped his vocal training years earlier, just redirected toward his body instead of his voice. Fans responded warmly to the openness with which he shared the journey, praising not just the physical change itself, but his willingness to talk candidly about the struggle behind it. As of early 2026, Jonathan describes himself as entering a new chapter of his career. He released a reimagined cover of John Legend's All of Me as a lead single from a new album, Speaking to You, which draws on both his classical training and a more contemporary sensibility than his earlier solo work. The album followed his 2024 holiday release, Christmasland, and continues a run of steady output that's kept him connected with a loyal fan base who call themselves the Fantoins.